Right, everyone, welcome back and welcome in to the By Josephine.k podcast. That's actually not the name of the podcast. It's Promise You'll Tell by Josephine Connectly. I'm here today with Charli Clement, and we often within our group chat find ourselves alluding and discussing psychiatry, but more specifically our experiences of inpatient psychiatric care away from home, a never-ending sleepover within a psychiatric system. And I think this is going to be really interesting because I know that I'm very outspoken about how unimpressed I am about what modern psychiatry is. And I know that Charli has their own takes on things. And we don't always agree on things, which I think is what makes a strong friendship, but B, an actually interesting conversation. Because who wants to sit with two people being like, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I know. So dull. What our game plan for today is, we are going to give some context on who we are and why we're talking about this. And then we're going to give a deep dive into our own experiences of inpatient and riff from there. It's definitely going to be in a conversational format. I know that I like that the best, and I know that everyone who listens to this podcast likes sticking this on, having it on in the background, almost as if you are the third party within a conversation. So welcome in, and welcome, Charli, to the podcast of all podcasts.
I'm Charli. I use they, them pronouns. Job-wise, I do a bit of everything. A good chunk of my work is in the NHS and the charity sector, working on changing psychiatric care. So I do a lot of work on system change, on human rights, on sensory needs and stuff like that. And then elsewhere, I create, speak, write, all of that nice fun stuff. Yeah, so I come to the space as autistic, ADHD, dyspraxic, chronically ill person who was inpatient, but kind of didn't really need to be inpatient, and someone who's kind of now working within that sector and seeing what's kind of going down over there.
So how old are you when you were inpatient? Because I know that you were definitely younger than me.
Yes. So I was 15. My crisis started at 14. I was inpatient the winter that I was 15.
There's going to be a lot of me pulling this face. You can just feel it. Being 15 as it is, then it's winter and then you're impatient.
I mean, it was Christmas. Like, I was in over Christmas. The first time I got to leave the unit was on Christmas Day. And they had given me 4 hours of leave, and I begged them for 6 hours to go home for 6 hours. And I ended up returning early. So I think I only did use about 4 hours because I just found home so overwhelming. Because home, for the first time when you're in that environment, was gonna be overwhelming anyway, but for then to be Christmas Day, which is just absolute chaos, like I just got so overwhelmed. So yeah, it was winter, which is horrible anyway. It was Christmas. Being 15 is horrible. I just started my GCSEs. There were so many things that just made it so awful.
No, completely. Yeah, you've just reminded me of that, like, first day out. Bizarre. We're going to definitely loop back to that. If you feel comfortable, you've mentioned how you weren't meant to be there in the first place. What was happening for you? What were you experiencing so that your health professional, psychiatrist, psychologist was like, right, so the next step on this plan, you're going on holiday. Might not be the best one you've ever been on. Have fun.
So I started having panic attacks in the spring time of the same year, and I kind of had one that was very circumstantial, that was for really specific reasons, so we kind of thought that would just be it. I was a very anxious person. By this point, my mood wasn't like great a lot of the time. I wouldn't necessarily call it depression, but I was bullied heavily for years and years, so I wasn't in a great state, but like nobody had identified the autism, and nobody was like particularly concerned. And then I started having these panic attacks, and they just kept happening and kept happening. So I ended up moving school and starting in CAMS, who picked up the autism. Well, they actually weren't the first to pick up the autism, but maybe we'll come back to that. And then in the November, they started me on a medication, and I just had a really adverse reaction, such a random reaction that we'll really never know the roots of. I ended up in A&E. Basically, I was fitting. They kind of sent me home, and then I just fitted for like weeks and weeks, in and out of A&E, in and out of my psychiatrist, and eventually they had me assessed, and they were like, right, we think a ward would be the best place for you right now. And now I can look back and go, actually, any other support would have been better, like respite, like supported living, respite for my family. Because by this point, my mum's been sleeping on my floor for a month. It was very clear that the family needed support and I needed support. I don't think now anyone would go, yeah, that's worth admitting someone to a ward for, because I got on the ward and it became clear very quickly, I think, to everyone that I was not there for the right reasons. And I think the staff knew that really quickly. And I kind of got quite a lot of animosity from staff for that, I think. But it wasn't my fault. I didn't choose that. So yeah, and I mean, it was relatively short. The average for an autistic person is 4.9 years at the moment. But yeah, that's so the National Autistic Society find out these stats regularly alongside the NHS. For a while it was 5.5 years, and it has gone down slightly to 4.9, I think it is at the minute. But obviously that's still beyond ridiculous, and it's because people get stuck. Like, people go in there and then they get institutionalized, or the system doesn't have anywhere for them to move on to afterwards, or they're getting segregated long term. So yeah, the average is over like nearly 5 years basically. So I had a short admission, but the trauma and the damage that it did is like everlasting. Like, I'm still working on it.
4.9 years.
Yeah.
I do find we both knew this would happen when we do this podcast, but I have such visceral reactions because I think, like you say, you've got your own trauma response from that experience. So like those memories that are in our literal like cells are like, how do you remember that one? But also it's so systemic and it's simply what's accepted. And I think for you and me, we can have these conversations. And while I've just said, yes, I'm having a very visceral reaction, we can have the conversations. I feel like most people don't understand, get overwhelmed, are so scared of doing the wrong thing that they don't have the capacity to be like, yeah, we should really look at this and analyze this and be like, we've got a 15-year-old coming in here who's been given a medication. We're working out the medication journey. They're now fitting, have been for a month. How best shall we do this? You can almost imagine the professionals in that situation being like, right, quickly, panic. What do we do? Instead of having that really informed, calm thing of like, what will serve this child the best? And that is so wild to be there. And again, you're 15 and you have this awareness of like, I shouldn't be here. I'm not saying that everyone would understand what inpatient care is, but it is probably, like you've said, Charlie, a very institutionalized, least normal environment anyone could be in. And I definitely think it should be avoided unless you actually genuinely need to be there.
Yeah, I think I'm someone who believes that at somewhere down the line there should not be psychiatric units, at least in their current format. I wholeheartedly believe in that, and I think if people are interested in that, looking into abolition is a really useful and important thing, because that's not just about prisons, that is about things like psychiatric units as well. I really recommend the book Mad World. Misha Fraser Carroll is so good. So I wholeheartedly believe that at some stage we will get to that point. We're obviously not there right now. There are people that need a heavier amount of support that at the moment is only provided by inpatient care. But so many of those beds are actually taken up by people who don't need to be there, who are autistic or have a learning disability and actually need something significantly different, but are just being placed there by virtue of there not being enough community care. And we do have measures in place to try and prevent that. I work on some of them and they are changing and they are beginning to do that job, but it isn't enough. There's like over 2,000 beds currently taken up by autistic people and people with a learning disability. You can be sectioned without a mental health diagnosis and just being autistic and having a learning disability. That is apparently going to be changed in the new Mental Health Act, but it didn't get through on this parliament, and now we've obviously got the election, and it wasn't in the King's Speech anyway, so it was unlikely to happen in this parliament anyway. But if that comes back up, it would potentially be in the Mental Health Act that you couldn't be sectioned just with autism or a learning disability. However, that doesn't really account for people who do have a co-occurring condition but would still find that that's not the right environment for them. So it doesn't really matter in a sense, because it still wouldn't be enough. But I think it's really difficult to kind of look back for me and go, we trusted those people. Those doctors who decided to make that decision for me had never met me before. They met me for an hour and a half. There were two doctors came and assessed me, had never ever met me, had that conversation, an hour and a half later said, we're going to recommend a bed for you. And that's led to 8 years of ongoing trauma. How wild is that? Like an hour and a half and decision by two people who had never ever met me. Like, I find it utterly wild.
Me too, man. As soon as you said it, my whole body went cold. We trusted those people. Do you have that like with your mum as well? Me and my mum, we can't really talk about it because I get so like this, and you're my friend and I feel really safe with you. So with a family member where you're trying to like protect their feelings, or we just can't have the conversation. But it is that thing of, these are the professionals that we took our children to, and these professionals, the experts, best in their field, that's the actions that they took. And as an adult who's like our parents, who would have been just like, well, obviously I'm going to trust you because this is your job. How my job is to like raise these children as best I can. I'm now getting this external care. For these adults to then be like, and this is the choice we've made in an hour and a half, is like, what?
I mean, me and my mum are very open. We've been close my whole life. So we do actually have a lot of conversations about it. But I'm not sure we'll ever quite get to the root fundamentally, because ultimately she was being traumatized just as I was. It's secondary trauma, sure, but it is also, I think the system tends to talk about secondary trauma for parents, but it doesn't talk about the primary trauma. Like, sure, it is secondary in that I was the one in the unit, but also there's a primary trauma there of handing over your child, and your child being in that environment and having to come and visit them and having to advocate for them, because we weren't told that I could have a professional advocate. So she's having to do that work. She'd been sleeping on my floor for a month by this point. So she's handing me over when she's been attached to me at the hip for a month. I don't think there's enough accountability for what the system actually does to parents and families and carers alongside their young people. She never got offered any therapy for that. She never got offered any support for that. And we've really had to find that for ourselves. And I think as well for me is like, I don't have a CPTSD diagnosis, but I would not go back into the system for one now, because the system is what traumatized me. So why would I go back there and say, I want you to diagnose me with something that you caused? And iatrogenic harm is not really believed or understood by the system anyway. See that?
Please tell us what that is.
Iatrogenic harm is basically harm caused by the system. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice that it has a name nowadays. Like, but yeah, the Google definition is like relating to illness caused by medical examination or treatment. It can have other forms where it's like if you had a surgery and something happened that went wrong, sort of thing. But it can also mean like trauma from the system in terms of things like psychiatric. So it's got quite a wide meaning. But if you were thinking about trauma informed practice, then we can talk about iatrogenic harm as in the system and systemic issues. But yeah, there's like little to no accountability there, because people don't want to go back into the system that traumatized them, so they're not seeing those patients really afterwards. And I always say, because I do a lot of trainings for staff who are on units, who are on wards, and I often say that chances are, unless they're readmitted, you're not going to see that person again. You're not ever going to know the damage that you've done. So it's very easy for them to keep doing damage because they just don't know what the impact is long term.
And I think as well, when you're there, shall I give the quickest intro of like how I came to be in that situation, just so there's like context. So as a child, I would just never talk about my feelings. Someone was a cry it out child, and that someone was me. So I learned very young, if you express or talk about the way you feel, you're going to be punished. That's going to lead you to be isolated. So I just had this inability to talk about anything, but was severely depressed from, say, 10. But I just had this fear of telling anyone about it. But it kind of compounded, and you've got a pressure cooker. I don't remember how it happened, but at around 17, we had like a little blip of might I get help at like 15, but I was so scared. So 17 was the point where I was like, I need help now. I come from a very privileged background. slightly won the birth lottery in terms of resources. Wouldn't say so with epigenetics. Whoever's in charge of my life was like, we're going to really balance this one out. It was the case like signing up for CAMS and then CAMS just being slow and dysfunctional. So our family going, right, we'll go private then. There's this guy that we've been recommended in 7X. We'll go and see him. Go and see this guy. And he's like, on the first meeting, I come in with my pink hair and my Uggs and I'm like, And he's like, have you heard of bipolar 2? And I was like, no, I haven't. He's like, well, let me tell you about it. But before we start, you can't do anything about it. And here's how other people with bipolar have died. I'm giving this context as in the stories that were surrounding the diagnoses and the labels that I was given was very much, this is your lot, nothing you can do. Here's some drugs. So I was put on, and me and Charlie were talking about the quetiapine that we've both experienced. Bipolar drugs are savage and really not very good for autistic bodies. Obviously, we didn't know about the ADHD and autism at the time. I was put on all the drugs and was very quickly put on like the maximum legal dose for a 17-year-old to be on mood stabilizers and antipsychotics. And I went through all the drugs very quickly and was having these ab reactions to all of them. But what people don't tell you when you go onto these drugs is that they're really hard to come off of, especially if you are taking drugs that mess with your GABA receptors. And as autistic people, GABA's this whole thing. We won't deep dive into it today. GABA's like a thing. So I got stuck on these drugs and my behavior and my mood was only getting worse. I got caught shoplifting. I would never shoplift. I got my tongue pierced. I didn't have any friends. I just looked like a dead person. I was sleeping in my parents' room on the floor at 17 and the whole thing was a disaster. Finally crawled over the finish line of finishing school and didn't care, was so apathetic. My journals are a crime scene to look at. The only time I kept a journal, which I guess is good because they're so depressing. But I very much was like, I want to come off of these drugs. And also I'm probably going to tap out soon. Again, like you're saying, your parents are trusting you to go and see these psychologists who are still like, just we'll find the right drugs. No one was really putting me in therapy at the time, but anyway. And they were like, right, well, you should probably go inpatient. I wasn't sectioned. Part of me thought that going would be helpful. I was raised on Girl Interrupted, Prozac Nation, and in my mind, I thought the inpatient wards is where the work really happens. Fine, I'll go. They look like they can be really helpful in all the movies because mental health wasn't talked about at this time. This was like 2015. I was like, okay, this is going to be really beneficial, but also I just don't care. I'll try anything. At the time, I slightly manically signed up for like 3 jobs and I just got a job waitressing at Bill's. So I had to email Bill's and be like, guys, I genuinely did this. Guys, I can't take the job because I have bipolar 2 and I'm going to do inpatient now. I can't take the job. I'm off. You can imagine them just like, fuck. So that happened. My intention going in there was to come off the drugs and inevitably was only put on more of them, including aripiprazole that had me doubled over with heart palpitations. Charlie was in a child and teenagers unit, and then I was 6 months into being 18, so I was on like an adult priory ward, which was weird.
I think there is like some really key differences in that. I was also on a priory ward, like NHS funded.
Which one were you in?
Birmingham.
Imagine if we were in the same one. I was in Bromley. Priory something.
I mean,
fuck the Priory. Yeah. Shit as well. Sorry, no offense, Priory, but you're literally rubbish. So embarrassing.
Don't sue us. I mean, the thing is, right, is like I'm not anti-drug by any means. I'm perfectly fine with medication when it works, when it's right. I take medications that I might be on my whole life. If I am, I am. If I'm not, I'm not, for various reasons. I'm not anti-medication at all. However, I didn't need to go on another medication when I entered that unit. What I needed was the fits to stop, which they did. That's a whole thing. We still don't know why. I just didn't need to be put on another medication at that point. But that's their MO. Like, that's just what they do. CAMS unit is assessment and treatment. The assessment was that I needed my autism assessment to happen. I got diagnosed. And treatment, they apparently time for another medication, and I've never got off it since. It's been 8 years and I am in the best mental state I've probably ever been in, and I cannot get off it. Every time I've tried to dial it back. I've been able to do it for a bit and then it's had to go up again. I'm not on a really heavy dose, but considering the lack of need, it's a high enough dose. And I find that really difficult because it's a really difficult conversation to have with people where you're saying, it's not that I'm against medication when it's needed. I am not anti-drug for mental health when it's used properly and when people are supported and given access to what they need. But for me, this is not something that I need now, and it's not something I really needed then. And how do you begin to navigate that? And I wouldn't say I really had informed consent to go on that medication. I got told off for trying to Google it. I didn't manage, I think I managed to call my mum to talk about it, but only for a couple of minutes, so she didn't even have time to talk to me properly about it. That's not informed consent. To be handed a A4 piece of paper with maybe some side effects, that's not informed consent.
And the way they give you those sheets as well, do you remember they give you the sheet, but you can look at this, we'll just give it, you don't worry about it, it's just a side
you're gonna
effect.
have it either way. They act as if there's a decision there, and there isn't really a decision there. It was kind of more like, we're informing you that we are going to put you on this. I find it really difficult, and I'm still working on the animosity that I have to the system for that, especially because for me, what the medication that I'm on does do is it slightly calms it slows my brain down a small amount. And for me now, I understand that I am ADHD, and that's all internal hyperactivity. When I was diagnosed autistic, nobody went, maybe there's also ADHD here. So everything was, that's autism associated anxiety. At the time, a lot of my racing thoughts were anxious, but now I still have racing thoughts, but they're not inherently anxious. They are sometimes, but they're not all anxious. They're just really fast. And now I understand that as ADHD because I picked that up myself. But I was in the mental health system for how many years, and at no point did someone go, maybe there's also ADHD here. And the co-occurrence is 50 to 70%. It should have been, I personally think that if you're assessed for one, you should just be assessed for another in an ideal world. But because I present as female and I present quite internally, nobody picked it up, and then I picked it up myself. So I have quite a lot of animosity to the system where I'm going, yeah, my brain was really fast and maybe this medication helps it a tiny bit, but I'd be way better off on ADHD medication for sure.
It's where were you to the doctors? And I think that's, I agree with everything that you've just said. It's if you truly need these medications, perfect. But I know for me, after I got diagnosed with ADHD at 25, when the ADHD drugs just weren't working, because my nervous system was way too ramped up, traumatized to be throwing more gasoline on the fire. And I said to him, I was like, right, these aren't working for me. What else can we do? The professional, the guy with the job that's lauded as the god of mental health, the psychiatrist, is sat opposite me going, oh yeah, unless it's drugs, I literally can't help you. What? I really agree with you in terms of, if we can have these realizations of I may be experiencing ADHD or autism. Let me now look at other people who are experiencing the identical thing as me. For me, it's always how can I see this so clearly, and why is it so difficult for the professional who is paid to do this as their job? Why do they not have that same realization? If I think back at the other people who I was in, the other adults who were in the psychiatric ward, there was a girl 1 year older than me with a aggressive case of anorexia, definitely also autistic, definitely also experiencing ARFID. You think of the so many people there, it's oh yeah, you're experiencing autism, no wonder all of us were distressed. You're already functioning in a body that is overwhelmed with livers that are kind of doing the best they can with what they have, to then kind of lump everyone inside with no stimulus, no activities apart from CBT, and then be drugging everyone so heavily that everyone is passed out asleep at 10 p.m. It's is this care, or is this a very expensive holding cell?
Yeah.
How do you get any job satisfaction from going to work and perpetrating that every day when no one's making any progress?
So there's been some studies where in the last few years where we've had units assess everyone who comes in the door for autism, and those studies have come back saying around 60% anecdotally of CAMHS inpatients are autistic. Now that's staggering. That's a staggering number of young autistic people to be entering those spaces. And those spaces, the sensory environment is so bad for anyone. You've got loud alarms, you've got bright lights, you've got loud cutlery when you're eating because the walls are really echoey. You've got small spaces. You haven't got enough outside space. I mean, we couldn't go outside without supervision at all. You've got lack of connection to family. A lot of my sensory regulation tools were taken away because they had metal. My communication cards were taken away. I couldn't have any headphones. I couldn't have music. And then you've got like you said, the understimulation of there not being enough activity. I mean, I was quite lucky. Our ward did have a few different kinds of therapy. But isn't it mad that I'm saying I was lucky that there was some therapy?
Mm-hmm.
Like in a psychiatric space it's meant to help you recover. I'm saying that I was lucky that there was some therapy. But so we had some therapy, we had some education, but that the stimulus was not there. So you're chronically understimulated, but you're also chronically overstimulated. There's no wonder that autistic people get stuck in those spaces for so many years and become institutionalized. You know, studies have found that autistic people in those spaces are more likely to be over medicated, to be restrained, they're more likely to be secluded. There's a heavy amount of issues with bias and also with people being so over and understimulated simultaneously that they have such high reaction to the space that they're in. And you look at these spaces, and for me, it's so obvious. I look at them and I go, I could not live here. And I did have to live there. I find it so hard and so horrible now. Part of my job is to go into those spaces and tell staff how they can change the sensory environment, but a lot of stuff is the built environment. Some of it is about staff changing their own perceptions and changing their own behavior and culture and supporting autistic people to regulate better by bringing things in, but some of it is built environment, and we're saying you need to change the lights or you need to change the alarms, and actually there's no funding to do that. So we're stuck in this like cycle where there's nowhere else for people to go. But if they enter those spaces, they're not right for them. It's like impossible. It's such a cycle and it feels so utterly impossible to change it.
It's so you know, we started this conversation saying about how people get overwhelmed, and yet it is so overwhelming because it is the extent of this is how much adjustment needs to be made. And I keep thinking at the moment how slightly jarring how open-minded seems to be quite a rare quality, and the way that within Western medicine they're trained so that the guy who's got the doctorate and the PhD, he is the know-all and the be-all. But it's so, you go from being like, I really want to help people, but the only way I can do it is to do it through this pathway, and I need to study this way because otherwise everyone's going to think I'm a joke. Like with me in the hypnotherapy, I understand that hypnotherapy in the mainstream, it's seen as like a joke, and it's like, fine. If I think I was more ego driven, I probably wouldn't touch that title, and I may even be like, oh well, I'm just do CBT because that's what's respected, and then I can be the amazing psychologist that people turn to and go, we accept the way that you work. But then I would be perpetrating the system that we're discussing. And it's almost, it's an interesting one to explore of the social sacrifice you make in terms of people respecting you and deeming what you do to be valid for the huge benefit of going, cool, this group of people that I support and help, they're turning around and they're saying that it's the best they've ever felt in years. And they know that it's something that's sustainable. They feel supported and they feel safe there. I think my point is it's really unfortunate and aggravating to me that the mainstream approach that's available to the majority of people is like very close-minded, very much we're the professionals, you're the patient, you don't have autonomy, here's your side effect sheet, not that you need to use it because we're giving you this drug anyway. Whereas when we treat human beings as human beings and we're like, oh, we're placing you into, or even to say to someone, a 15-year-old is still nuts, we're placing you into a really traumatizing environment, how can we support you with this? Because you are away from your friends and family, people are then going to come visit you, and your whole, for me, I found that I think my aunt visited me and some of my friends visited me, my mum definitely came. It's a very weird dynamic, and you're the person they're having to drive hours to come and visit. I was fried on more drugs than ever. I was there for 4 weeks because I begged and screamed to leave now knowing that I was having a huge PMDD episode and was like, I don't need to be here anymore, I can't have this, because it was the week before my period, and they were like, okay, you can leave now. I did like a couple of DBT sessions there, and then I never went back ever again.
We had group DBT.
Yes.
And I couldn't do it. Like, the staff would be like, Charli, you need to go to group DBT. And I just refused to go. I engaged with every other kind of therapy on that ward. We had drama therapy, art therapy, relaxation stuff, and I engaged with all of that. But if I hadn't engaged with those, like some people on the ward did, they wouldn't have blinked. Like, those were optional, but they really wanted you to go to DBT, which
I
is,
fucking loved it.
again, I am not anti-DBT. Like, it really helps lots of people. But for me, that wasn't what was working. But the system said, that's the one we really want you to focus on, just because that was normal. Art and drama were an addition, whereas they saw that as like core to the program. And I didn't want to do that because I didn't conform to what it was trying to tell me, especially in a group space. Like, group therapy is just not for me. Like, as an autistic person, socially, just not the one. But yeah, like, thinking about visiting and stuff as well, my family definitely came in and out because I was only about 20 minutes from home, thankfully. It's becoming less of a rarity to be placed near your home. Like, they're trying to reduce out of area admissions. But at the time, people was being sent hours away. And the 10 days between them deciding I needed a bed and getting a bed, we had no idea if I'd be 20 minutes away or 2 hours. But yeah, there is this weird thing where it's that vulnerability. I became more ill than ever on that ward. Like, I ended up mimicking a lot of people's behavior because I didn't have any other ways to regulate. I physically couldn't regulate in the ways that I would at home, or didn't have any support to regulate, and that so many of my tools had been taken away that I just picked behavior up off other people. And I still have some of those behaviors now, and I find that really, really difficult because I got threatened with discharge. Like, they started putting posters around the ward saying, if you copy other people's behavior, we will discharge you. Like, it was like threatening. Like, they'd put posters around, and they're like, I can't help it. Like, this is mimicking, this is masking, because I physically don't have any other way to get this anxiety and overwhelm out of my body. And nobody seemed to understand that. I definitely found it really hard. Like, my siblings would come on the ward. They were tiny at this point. Like, the oldest of my siblings was 10 at this point. And the younger two were like 5 and 2. So, like, absolutely tiny. And I think the first time they came onto the ward was Christmas Day. Like, they came to get me, to bring me back home in the car. Again, like I was talking about my mum before, but there was no support for these tiny humans who are still, you know, very much developing, and have just watched their sister be fitting for a month, and then she's been taken away. I don't think we'll ever quite understand if there's been any damage done because of that. And for a long time, like, if anyone said they were going to the hospital, even if it was just for an appointment, they'd get really upset because they thought people weren't going to come back. Again, it's this thing of the harm of the system goes beyond me as the inpatient. It actually does to out into your whole family, and into your friends. My friends had no idea how long it was going to be, if something had happened to me. It ripples out to so many people. And none of these people get any support for that
at all. I remember I'd call people in pure distress, calling people, messaging them. I remember like a boy that I was friends with at the time messaging me like, I don't know how to navigate this, you're really scaring me. And it's like, yeah, I bet I was. This is awful. The whole thing's bizarre, and the more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm remembering it. The level of miscommunication, incommunication, like you're saying, you're mimicking people's behaviors. I definitely did that as well, or picked up some old habits. I'm like, I'm bringing this one back because it's available to me now. It's like, you're meant to be here to be supported and healing. And I think they position, at least I understand, inpatient is positioned as, you're going to be nurtured and cared for. All your needs are going to be met. We're going to give, this is respite. This is rest. Come in and rest from the world. We're going to provide everything that you need. Whereas in reality, like we're both saying, you are entered into a space that is hostile. It's not geared towards human-centered care. It's based on, like with the DBT thing. The reason that CBT is prolific as it is because they're they do a lot of data getting. How do you feel on a rate of 1 to 10? How do you feel 1 to 10, 1 to 10, 1 to 10? Most therapies do not start with a 1 to 10. I would never ask my clients out of 10, how do you feel about this? Because they're going, what
I
do you mean?
hate scales.
How do I apply a number to this very, like earlier it was like, what? But the reason that CBT, and this is not a me thing, is like the truth. The reason that it became so prolific was so that they had the data to back it up, like that thing that you posted on your that new approach they've invented for helping general anxiety with autism. There was so much data in that report, and like
So much
graphs
data.
and stuff, whereas
And so much economic data specifically. Everything is about how cheaply can we do it. Literally everything is how cheaply can we do this? How can we make people contribute more to the economy, either through themselves being able to go back to work or through them paying for the therapy? It's get you in, get you out again. And it's not about your quality of life. It's not about the community care that you need. It is, how can we make this the least expensive? How can we basically stack you up? How can we, more people in, more people out, more money, less cost? And that's what 6 sessions of CBT does, like, fundamentally. And for me, psychiatry is so heavily based in capitalism in its current form. And I find that really, really difficult, especially when it comes to things like autism, where actually can't be treated and don't want to be treated, but the system will still try to, because that's the best way forward for the system to get more money, like, fundamentally. When you kind of look at the roots of it, and again, I really recommend Mad World on this, and also Radical Intimacy, and that's Sophie K. Rosa, and also We're All Neurodiverse, that's Sunny Jane Wise. All of those books are really great for context around capitalism, psychiatry, white supremacy, etc. When you start to like look at it and unpick it and kind of understand. Oh, and also Empire of Normality, that's Robert Chapman. I should have said that one first, that's my favorite. All of those books are really good at kind of going, what is happening within this system? Where are the roots? And why are we perpetuating them? And why is society continuing to allow this?
Literally.
And once you start looking at it, you never stop.
You can't look away. It's like the worst car crash ever.
Yeah.
And I find it jarring for me personally. I'm not saying this is the right view, but I find it jarring that people are so resistant to just looking at the roots of how something came to be. It's okay for us to look at how a system that a lot of us are now like locked into came to be. And I do understand that when we're overwhelmed anyway, the idea of biting the hand that feeds is overwhelming. But I know for me, when I talk about stuff that I've deep dived into, like we're both saying with like the roots of psychiatry, it's a dark story, but almost you receive judgment for daring to look behind the curtain and being like, hold on a minute, who's come up with this?
And looking into it doesn't mean you can't also engage in it if that's what you want to do. Like I said before, I'm not anti-medication. I'm not inherently anti-CBT. I mean, I don't think it works for a lot of people, and I think especially it doesn't work for a lot of autistic people. But I'm not saying don't go and get CBT if that's what you need, if that works for you. But what I am saying is, actually, there are roots within this system that I think are worth understanding, and it has helped my personal understanding of where I sit as an individual within a wider society to understand that, because I think it's very easy to kind of see yourself as one person, especially when you're in crisis. You're obviously only going to be you're not going to be able to look particularly beyond yourself at that point, and that's fine. But I actually think for me there's been a certain element of empowerment for me to go, this isn't really a me problem.
Yeah.
Like, this is society, and this is capitalism, and this is all of these systems. And the way the system has treated me is because it is based in these systemic issues. And actually, I have found that quite empowering. So it's not me saying, don't get treatment, don't take medication, don't go to therapy. It's none of that. But actually, for me, there's been a certain element of being able to go, I am going to engage in these things, and I am still going to take my medication, all of that. But I can also go, the issues that I've had and the way that I've been treated are not inherently about me. They're not a failing by me as a person,
Mm.
you know?
I think that's a big, I think a part of me felt like I'd failed the inpatient journey. I came out way worse, like you say, way more traumatized, and it was very weird very quickly. I think let's talk about how we kind of wish things had gone afterwards. Because I know for me, my psych ward journey was like the catalyst to then 9 or 10 years of pure chaos. Because I know for me, going into the psychiatric unit as the child in an adult space. I know 18 you're legally an adult, but I think you become an adult at like 25 when your prefrontal cortex steps up a notch. I know for me that it really felt very disillusioned, very nihilistic within that space. You kind of walk in going, oh, this could be really helpful. Maybe finally I am going to feel safe and not so acutely depressed. I know the word depression's not as heavy as it used to be, but just like feel that depression, everyone, like the heaviness and the gravitas of that experience. And I really went in there hoping and believing, which kind of makes me feel sad, that I would have walked out there different and with access to what I need. Whereas I walked out more traumatized, more disillusioned. And I didn't, like we've said, I didn't trust the caregivers around me. And I think it really affected my relationship with my actual caregivers in real life, because I was so jarred by it that I was like, I can't trust anyone. And then very quickly afterwards kind of fell into this whole like grooming cycle, which sometimes I still feel guilt and shame about. But when I think about it in this context, it's like, no, that makes sense that these things happened. You were in a very odd situation where the official good and shiny grown-ups in the white coats ended up doing more harm than good. Like I'd be in the psychiatric ward and the guy that diagnosed me with bipolar would kind of be having lunch in the same room as you, and you're sat there looking at the guy who kind of started this whole thing, gave you the drugs, gave you the diagnoses, just in pure panic, just like, this is so bizarre, this is so weird. I know for me, I wish that after I'd left the psychiatric ward, I also like moved in with my aunt. I was like, I'm not moving home, I'm moving in with my aunt, like across town. And everyone was like, okay, whatever
We
you want
see
to
that a
do.
lot. We see
Like,
that a lot. We see a lot of young
okay,
people who don't feel like they can go back home.
you're like a different fucking person.
And that's why a lot of people get stuck, because there isn't somewhere else for them to go. So they don't want to go home, and that makes sense. But the system hasn't got enough in place for people to do anything else. So if there's not a social care need, they just either get stuck or they are forced back into the home.
I think the
Yeah.
psychiatric ward affected me more than I realized. I know I'm laughing because it's like your body
Well,
kind of meeting you in the
this is the
moment.
thing.
So yeah, like left there 2 days after, like got my job that would lead to the whole grooming cycle, but was very, I think all the adults around me were just like, we don't know what to do, we're gonna let her be in charge, and if there's this new figure in her life that's claiming he's got the answers, great. Hopefully this will be better. And I remember like with the DBT afterwards, I very quickly realized I don't want to go to DBT. I want to go to my cool new job where everything's cool and people make me feel like I matter and I'm important.
Yeah, and I think you said something really interesting there about families then feeling like they have to hand the control to us because we've had that taken from us. Like you've just been taken away from your family and your friends and your school and all your belongings and everything that you are. And you come out, and I think there is that immediate thing where you want to reclaim that control. And I do
Mm,
think a lot of families kind of let that happen because they don't really know what else to do, and there's no support for them to do that. And me and mum have had conversations before where she said at that time she just didn't know what to do with me, and she ended up having conversations with her friends who were saying like, that's still a young person, like I was still 15 at this point, and you are still the parent, you are allowed to still impose that control on them, obviously not like in a super controlling way, but in like a, you are the parent, they can't just run ragged, like they can't just shout at you all the time and all of these things. And I think my mum really had a really long and difficult process of reclaiming her parenthood. because it
God,
had been
yeah.
taken from her. Like, I had been taken out of her space. She wasn't allowed to control anything that was happening to me in a way she had for 15 years. And I think she had to like reclaim that actually she was the parent, because that's almost handed over to the staff. You essentially do hand that over and hand your young person over. So I think there was a long period of us having a real push and pull where I wanted control because I'd lost control, and she needed to have some sense of balance of parent, because she's not like a controlling parent, that's not what I'm saying, but you know, she was still the parent. So I think there's something really interesting about that, and about what happens within families, and that push pull of, I just want to be back in the driving seat of my own life.
Like a reintegration process, like how to truly welcome your child back into your family home when, yes, everything has changed and there is a part of their innocence and youth that's not coming back because they have experienced the most. It's such an extremely like volatile environment. I wish people could understand that, like, when you're in a psych ward, it's not just you there, you're there with other people who are also severely distressed. And with
Severely. And like,
you've
for
got
me, as someone who didn't need to be there, I didn't need to see all of that. But my unit was 17 beds. At any one time, there were 17 of us on 2 corridors. Like, my job now, where I go around other psych wards, I'm like, whoa, this is massive. Like, this is huge. Like, 2 corridors, 17 beds. So you are on top of each other, essentially. And yeah, like, the amount of really, really distressing things that I saw, the amount of peer support that I was providing because staff weren't providing it.
oh my God.
We weren't meant to, like, we weren't even meant to talk to each other about what we were going through, or our histories, or even the treatment we were having, but you're going to do that, like, because the staff weren't providing enough care. So you're providing all this peer support, you're seeing all these distressing things. Like, how are you meant to hold that? I'm 8 years down and I'm still dealing with that.
We're just going to have that silence for, because it is so much to move through. And it is weird, isn't it? Like 8 years on paper, that's quite a long time, but it really feels like yesterday. I was in
I mean,
Priory Hayes Grove, kicking
it's
it.
interesting, isn't it? Because it's like a third of my life when you actually think about it. Because I'm about to be 24. It's a third of my life I've been dealing with that. Like, actually, that's, you know, quite a big chunk, really. But also, like, relatively, it's not that long. It's interesting.
Third of your life. Okay, let's talk about our dream stay away from home psychiatric wards. When I went to an exhibition at the Welcome Centre 5 or 6 years ago, and this was the whole exhibition, it was all about asylums, essentially, that then became inpatient wards. And someone had made a model of like their dream care. And it was really interesting because they had like this, it was huge, this huge scripture that someone who was staying in Bedlam, which is like the Bethlehem place, that like the psych ward, they were staying there, and in like the 1800s they'd written in perfect script how they thought that it should be run. I don't think at any point anyone's really got an A star on inpatient mental health care. If it was me, it would be this space that would be very back to nature, and we're going to help and support you in the way that works for you. I mean, it's going to be the least profitable space in the world, but like, who cares? In the idealist, you'd be able to genuinely, truly teach people ways and means of really reckoning with what's happened, to be able to truly resolve and process those really gnarly things that have happened, so that people can be going to sleep going, do you know what? Today was really difficult and it was acutely challenging. However, I feel like every day I'm making 1% more progress. I'm feeling safer in my body. And then having that community care aspect there to be like, right, guys, here are guidelines of how to be with one another, but we're going to be here with you. And if you do feel unsafe, because this is like also a mixed ward, a mixed ward, like, here's how we can navigate this so that you can feel comfortable in your human body within this human experience. Low lighting, foods that are actually nourishing. I will never forget looking over at, because the girls and one guy who were experiencing eating disorders, they were upstairs and then they'd be able to come downstairs. but they would sit them in the hall with everyone else with these huge plates of just like sludgy, cheesy carbs. We know that autism and eating disorders hand in hand. What do autistic people have a lot of? Food intolerances. Why are you forcing these people to eat like mountains of like sludge food, which is going to make everyone not feel great?
I mean, I basically just ate a jacket potato twice a day for 3 months because I didn't like anything that was on the menu 90% of the time. So I would just eat jacket potatoes. And sometimes the jacket potato, like it had specific fillings. So if it was a cheese and bean day, I was fine. If it was tuna, I'm like, I'm just having a plain jacket potato. And that was for lunch and dinner. And then I'd have like the bread roll that was meant to come with soup, and I don't like soup. And then I'd have like 2 scoops of ice cream, like twice a
Real.
day for 3 months, like because none, and it became a joke. The staff thought it was hilarious.
What?
Like no one sat and went, maybe actually we should ask Charlie what sort of meals would support them to be nourished more. And it probably would be pretty similar meals a lot of the time. I do have a very limited diet, but my diet does span beyond jacket potatoes. Like that was all I was eating. And it became this hilarious joke. Like, I don't know if your ward had this, but when you left, you put your handprint on the wall, like in paint, and you'd like write your.
No.
So there was like a couple of walls, and you'd put your hand on it, and you'd
So
write like your
sad.
name and like your discharge dates, like and then you'd write like a little bit about your quote or whatever. And like one of my things that I wrote on the wall was like jacket potatoes because it had become this funny thing, and I had quote or whatever. And like one of my things that I wrote on the wall was like jacket potatoes because it had become this funny thing, and I thought it was funny at the time because everyone else had made it into this hilarious thing, but I was so embarrassed like that I wouldn't eat any other food, and no one had supported me to go, maybe we should get Charlie some other food. And also eating as an autistic person, right? I now understand that for a lot of autistic people, eating is not a social moment. Eating is one of the only times where all of your senses is engaged. Your interoception, because you're trying to work out if you're full or not, your proprioception, because you're trying to work out where you are in space with cutlery, your vestibular for similar reasons, and then all 5 of your external senses are also engaged. So it's one of the only times you're dealing with every single kind of sensory input. So there's no wonder why actually for most autistic people, eating is just not a social moment. But on a psych ward, you're all being forced to sit in the same room at the same time in a horrible echoey space. And we had what was called protected meal times as well. So you weren't allowed to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Like it's no wonder eating in that space is so difficult when eating at home was hard enough, let alone with strangers in a horrible environment. So it's really fascinating to me how much impact food and eating actually has in those spaces. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you about your question, but
No, but I think this is so important. We all know how important what we put in our bodies is going to affect it, but they're so dead set on like, we're going to find the right drugs. It's like, come on. We've mentioned the sensory aspect, what people are then being given. And then, like we know with the sensory aspect, in order to be able to actually digest and assimilate food, the nervous system needs to be supported so that it can rest and digest. What of me and Charlie have just described sounds like something that's conducive to that, which again kind of brings us back to that point of, to the people who are literally running the Priory today for what is it, like 10 grand a week, like just something next level. Do you feel proud of the work you're doing? Knowing what you know, and it's almost that case again of like, why do I know exactly what the body needs in order to be able to like digest and feel safe to be able to eat? Why do I know this and you don't know this, when you've got the leverage and the access and the availability to actually scale this and really bring it to people?
don't you think it's fascinating that as autistic people, we're seen as the rigid ones?
I wouldn't say we're very rigid.
I definitely have some rigidity and some things that I'm very specific about and rules that I believe in. But also, like, I'm a very nuanced person. and I can see beyond the systems that we are currently in. And I think that's really always interesting to me, is especially in a psych system, is this is how we've always done it. This is hospital policy. This is how it's going to work. But my rigidity is the kind that's the problem.
Yeah, completely. It's like, let's just look at your history of hospital policy. What are your actual success rates here? Oh, look, not great, is it? So an image that keeps popping into my brain is when we did once a week, we did art therapy. I can't remember what I was on at the time. Some sort of like cool thing, or like a diazepam day. That was exciting. But I'd sit and I'd get a Sharpie. I've just pulled out a paper, trauma recovery class. I'd get my Sharpie and then I'd just draw the most like aggressive teen angst stuff. But I think that's personal because I was a teenager.
I often wish, because I didn't bring my art therapy folder home at the time, and they were like, oh, we'll keep it for like 3 years if you ever want it. And I never got there where I wanted it. And now I'm like, I wish I could have it, because
I've definitely got mine.
I remember a lot of what I did, and a lot of it was not really art in the slightest. Like, I know a lot of it was just writing and writing and writing and big capital letters. And like,
Like,
I think one day I drew like a filing cabinet, and like the drawer of the filing cabinet was open, and like there were just loads of words spilling out, because at the time everyone was like, Charlie might have a mood disorder, might have blah 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 blah, and it turned out to just be autism and ADHD, like, obviously. But at the time, everyone was like, we might have to put you on these 6 families of medications, and you might have a mood disorder, and you might have depression, you might have all of these things. And like, I just used to write and write and write, and I wish I could have it back now. It's so difficult to look back on it and not be angry at so much
yeah.
of it, because it all seems so obvious to me.
Yeah, literally. It doesn't take much thinking to be like, not sure about this one, guys. And what I am thinking is, I wouldn't love that experience again. And if I was in front of a 15 or a 7 or an 18-year-old, I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, I would recommend you guys do this. But I think this conversation has really made me realize that it does serve as such fuel for me showing up, doing what I do now, and being like, why don't we try this? Let's create this new paradigm. We have been failed over and over and over, especially as autistic people. Let's get the support so that we can, yes, have help with our mental health, but in a way that's working with us and not against us. And I think this conversation has really highlighted to me why I do get so obsessive about it. Or like when you sent that link today, I do then have this thing, it's like, right, I need to go read that and I need to know everything about this. Here's how they could do this better, or look, it already exists, the solution they seek already exists, but for some reason people are just choosing to not look at it until it's going to be hugely profitable or available online, scalable enough.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, because I think you said it at the start, like, we don't always agree on everything, but I think we are coming to spaces with the same wants and desires and pretty similar experiences. We might have different opinions on how we would get there, or how that would look, or about how the body works, or whatever. Like, we're always going to have stuff where we do have those differences, and maybe occasionally we'll be jarred by each other, but actually we are coming at it from the same angle fundamentally, really.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I find really useful and really fascinating, and I think I'll always appreciate that challenge.
Yeah, it's like the same intention.
Yeah.
I quite like that as well. Maybe that's another marker of like autistic friendships. No one actually needs any of the same interests. I don't think I have many shared interests with most of my really good friends like you, or like with me and Ellen. We famously have nothing in common apart from we both like Melissa Broder, who's an author.
You two are the autism spectrum.
There's nothing in common, but we all are existing with the same intentions, and that is more than enough. And that's actually, I think, what makes such an interesting connection, because we're always drawing new people in. The people that I speak about, you guys have never heard of, or you have, and you're like, I know this. Or like today, I'm always looking, you guys are mentioning new people that I've never heard of before, and that's so much nicer than being in like the true health holistic space where you're like, yesterday I was sat in a sauna with men telling me what ketosis is. I know what this is. I don't need you to tell me again. Whereas I'd much prefer someone else be like, oh, here's this completely different thing that you've never heard of. I think I'd like to know like how you feel about that experience from where you stand now, and then
Sure.
anything else that feels like pertinent to tie together. Our rallying cry.
I think for me, it's definitely something I'm still working through. And I don't know how long I will have to work that through ultimately. Every time I get a bit closer, it feels like the box gets bigger. My therapist last week was saying, Charlie, I actually think we need to touch on this piece. And I just didn't think that that was part of what I needed. I just didn't know. It feels like it will always be there. I think for me, I'm really learning. So I've been working on the system, like in the system, for like 4 years. And I'm getting to a point now where my trauma is far enough away that I'm kind of like, do I want to work within this system? Because I think, when I started working on it, I was still so angry, and I definitely still have some anger, do not get me wrong, but I was so angry and so embedded in that trauma, and it was all that I was when I started that work. So I'm definitely at a point where I'm kind of going, who am I without that trauma? I will always have that trauma, but who am I where it's not the only things that I am and isn't the central part of me? So there's definitely still a lot of stuff there to think about, I think. For me, where there are so many other traumas that I've been through and my trauma being so complex, it all ties together somehow. Like my therapist will often like do a roundup of things we've talked about, and it'll always come back to the same roots. The feelings and thoughts that I have that are embedded in me, he will always manage to bring them back. And I think like accepting that and understanding that all of these traumas are quite different in what they are, but actually they're not that different in what they've done to me, is something that I'm still learning and still processing. Because every time he kind of says, like, he'll come back to something and I'll be like, how dare you? How dare you actually tell me that it's still all of the same thing? I will always want to change that system, and I will always want to advocate for people who are in that system. But I'm still learning how to do that without it me being all that I am,
Yeah, that's a huge one.
I can't remember the second half of your question.
I think the second half was how the adjustments that you'd want to make to the system, but in like our
Sure.
ideal dream world, funding doesn't have
Yes.
to exist.
I see it very complexly. Like I see it as almost different for every single person.
Yeah.
I think community care needs desperate amounts of expansion. We need different types of respite. We need different forms of supported living that are actually supported living and not just also psych wards, basically just tiny versions. We need a social care system that actually functions. We need spaces where human rights aren't being taken by virtue of someone not having capacity. The Mental Health Act needs a complete reform. So I think for me, I kind of don't see and for me, like psychiatric wards are kind of just not within that vision.
Yeah.
I'm sure there would probably be a version that looked very, very, very different of somewhere that people could go. But like for me, it's like crisis houses, crisis cafes. There's so many bits we can do to prevent before we need to get there. Or if it's not to prevent, it's to support. Like for me, it's all about health and social care and community care and a completely different vision of all of that. And I'm still learning what that looks like. I wrote my dissertation around capitalism and looked at some of that and some of the books that I talked about earlier in the pod that I really recommend on these things, because I'm still learning. Like I'm still learning to understand how these systems impact each other and are based in things like white supremacy and capitalism and the ways that things like abolition kind of works within all of this. So it's definitely something that I don't have a full answer on, and I won't pretend to. I think for me, there's like a whole new vision of community that just looks utterly different.
I love this. The new paradigm that we deserve. And I think that is almost beginning to pull at a completely different thread of, do we want to try and fix that current system, or do what everyone in our ideal world does is be like, we're just going to do a reset on this one. Let's just build this from the ground up. I may have mentioned this before, but I keep thinking about this at the moment. As there is more and more conversation surrounding ADHD and autism, I have this like intuitive feeling that it is ADHD and autism that is going to finally push the current mainstream offering of health to kind of take the human condition more seriously, because more and more people are going to be asking for support to the current systems that are going, well, we don't know what to do with you. And then there's going to be more people like me going, oh, but this is an option. And the metabolic health guys being like, this is an option. And this is an option. And I think it's going to be, we are living in one of the most fascinating times for everything. And I think especially when it comes to well-being, healthcare, community, people being able to exist as human beings away from over pathologizing. Charli, literally, thank you so much for today. I hope everyone can give this a couple of listens. I'm definitely welcoming everyone to do their own research into all aspects of these and really take time to reflect on, especially if you've had your own experience within psychiatric wards, psychiatric care in general. I definitely would welcome you to take some time in the way that feels best for you to reflect, journal, sing, shout, move, call a friend, make your own podcast about how you feel about this. Because I know that when I listen to stuff like this, I'm like, I feel many things right now, and giving yourself that space to then express what's coming up can be really supportive and really beneficial if you wish to do that. Charli, where on the internet can we find you?
I think my @ is the same everywhere now. And it's Charli Clement _ no E in Charlie, just to confuse you.
That's right. So that's CHARLICLEMENT Beautiful. My name is Josephine K. You can find me over on Instagram at byjosephine.k, K the letter. Thank you guys for being with us. Thank you for journeying with us, and we will talk to you in the next one. Adios.